Coming up, the shortcomings of American diplomacy.
I think that we're in an era now in which we no longer have the ability to dictate. We need to rediscover how to persuade.
Former U.S. Ambassador Chas Freeman discusses Israel, Saudi Arabia, China, and how to make foreign policy work. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
I'm delighted to welcome Chas Freeman this evening to the Carnegie Council. As I'm sure many of you know, he is a longtime public servant of the United States. As U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia during both Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Director of Chinese Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, with President Nixon in China in 1972. So he's had Middle Eastern, African, East Asian, and European diplomatic experience, a certificate in Latin American studies, and he's fluent in both the national and Taiwan dialects of Chinese from the Foreign Service Institute field in Taiwan. Recently, you wrote a very interesting piece called How Diplomacy Fails, and you quoted President Obama's by now quite famous speech at West Point, where he said, "Our military has no peer, but..."
Just because we have the best hammer does not mean that every problem is a nail.
And you said that insight implies we should be skilled at measure short of war, that is diplomacy. For many reasons we are not. We suffer from a strategy deficit. And you've also decried the tendency in certain quarters to dismiss diplomacy as, quote, namby-pamby nonsense before we send in the Marines. So maybe that's how diplomacy fails, but why does it fail?
Well, diplomacy basically presupposes engagement. It rests on empathy, which is quite different from sympathy. To empathize is to be able to understand and put yourself in the position of another party. And therefore to understand the motives, the reasoning, and be somewhat able to predict the activities of that party. And it also depends on a related gift, which is intuition. Intuition is the ability to make correct decisions when you don't have correct information or complete information. And it rests in no small measure on empathy. So if you sit where we do today and you speak as we used to speak of Mao's China, now we speak of North Korea and we say, well, they're irrational. What you're really saying is, I'm not going to spend the time to figure out why they believe what they do and why they're doing what they do, because they have their own reasons, which may be appallingly mistaken, but which nonetheless are there. So the basic reason that diplomacy generally isn't even tried by the United States. Diplomacy is not coercion. It can be coercive, but it is generally an effort to try to reach a mutual adjustment of relations on a subject to mutual advantage. And most often that is not a coercive process. It may be implicitly backed by a threat, but it is essentially a process of suasion. Our system puts a premium on declaratory approaches to foreign countries. We condemn them, we express outrage, we demonstrate self-righteous indignation, and we impose sanctions, which are a form of coercion, which Woodrow Wilson incorrectly said were more frightening than war and more likely to compel the surrender of other parties. And we now have 100 years of experience with Woodrow Wilson's thesis, and we can see that it never works. And yet we continue to do it because sanctions have all sorts of advantages. They shift the cost of foreign policy onto the private sector, not the politicians who impose the sanctions. They give the appearance of doing something. Generally, what they do is harden the attitude of the other side and unite it against those imposing sanctions. In a way, I guess what I was saying in that particular set of remarks was we don't give diplomacy a chance. We've gotten out of the habit of doing it. And perhaps that's because of our history and our geography. I think that we're in an era now in which we no longer have the ability to dictate. We need to rediscover how to persuade.
One of the Council's centennial themes that we focused on was democracy and its challenges. And while it's true to say that the ideal of democratic self-determination and self-rule have become the norm for more than 60% of the world's countries, it still, as a norm, faces challenges from non-democratic rule. Russia, for example, China, and to some extent India, among others, don't reflexively sign on to a one-size-fits-all sense of democracy that we would promote and sometimes seek to do so. And they've been quite allergic, in the case of the Chinese and the Russians, to outside interference. How do we deal with this sort of tugging in opposite directions of, on the one hand, the spread of democratic self-governance, and the other, resistance from other significant forces in the world?
Well, I would start from the basic proposition that the legitimacy of governments is to be determined by those they govern, not by foreigners. And the legitimacy of systems is really to be determined by the people who live in those systems. I have lived and worked, for example, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which has a system unknown to Aristotle, who gave us our terms, democracy, monarchy, and so forth. It's called in Arabic pejoratively, bedocratia, the meaning ruled by Bedouin or rule Bedouin style. And what this system does is empower a sheikh, a leader, or an emir or a king, not to be Henry VIII, to run rampant over the laws and those he governs, but to do two things. To proclaim a consensus, maybe to shape that consensus, to help form that consensus, but not to act outside a consensus. The King of Saudi Arabia has never cast the deciding vote in a divided cabinet meeting. Second, so he presides. He doesn't rule in the sense we imagine. And the second obligation of monarchy in that system is the fair distribution of the wealth, to ensure that the poor, the deprived, receive their fair share of the national income. Sometimes this, in the past, was a little bit absurd in how it was carried out. Abdulaziz, the founder of the kingdom, used to drive around. He drove himself, of course, because kings are manly and they do that. He would drive around Riyadh with a bag of gold coins, and when he saw some needy-looking fellow, he'd get out and give him one. But now there's the very sophisticated welfare system. Anyway, there is no evidence that people in Saudi Arabia consider this system at all illegitimate. They don't pay taxes. The government pays them, which is not a bad deal, I think. And so the question then is, really, what is the source of legitimacy? And we have decided in our society that the source of it is electoral. We actually, most of us don't vote, which is sort of an odd element here. But I don't think we have the mandate to impose our system, or can. It's often said we imposed democracy on Germany and Japan after World War II, but the fact was that Germany was a democracy before it was a dictatorship. And we revived the Weimar tradition and the democratic traditions of Germany very successfully. In Japan also, in the Showa democracy in the 1920s was where we found the leaders to bring Japan back into the democratic world. You won't find that tradition in Iraq to be revived. And if we looked for it, and there's not much evidence we did, it certainly didn't resurrect itself.
You mentioned your time as ambassador in Saudi Arabia, and that leads me to another intriguing phrase that I read in your various writings: the moral hazard inherent in U.S. policy. And you describe that basically as the condition that obtains when one party is emboldened to take risks it would not take otherwise because it knows another party will shoulder the consequences. In particular, you pointed on various occasions, I think, to our unqualified support for Israel and, quote, non-interference in illiberal monarchies like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. And you conclude, clearly U.S. policy is almost entirely about interests, not values. Now, with respect to Israel, for example, obviously support for Israel across the political spectrum is non-pareil, I would imagine, in any foreign policy environment. And is it also not true to say that Israel, however one may be critical, is willing to accept the consequences and does, on a fairly regular basis, accept the consequences of its policies?
No, I don't think so. I think actually the issue of moral hazard is at the heart of our difficulties in both the case of Israel and elsewhere in the Middle East. If you take, for example, not to start with Israel, I'll come to it, but if you take the example of our approach to the so-called Islamic State, I don't like to dignify it with that name, so I prefer to use the Arabic acronym, which is Daesh. Anyway, if this state, which is an existential menace to those in the region itself, but not to the United States, there's no prospect that we are going to be converted to this peculiar version of Islam or subjected to it. If this menace is not confronted by the people in the region, but by us, then why should they do anything? And this is moral hazard, and it is exactly what we're engaged in Iraq and Syria at the moment. If the people who are directly at issue and in jeopardy will not act to defend themselves, if they insist on assigning higher priority to other objectives, for example, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad or rolling back Iranian influence in the region or pushing back the Shiite expansion in Iraq that we inadvertently catalyzed, then that's a choice they can make. But it is a very, very poor basis on which to commit American prestige or lives. With Israel, the United States has cast, I think, 48 vetoes in the United Nations Security Council to protect Israel from the consequences of its actions under international law. We subsidize it. I find myself drawn morally to the requirement to object. I'm a taxpayer. I pay for it. I'm responsible. What happened in Gaza was funded by Americans. The weapons that were used were resupplied by us. We are responsible. Now, perhaps we're proud of that responsibility. That's a justifiable position. But we can't escape responsibility. And if we say to Israel, no matter what you do, we'll back you, then we have no influence. And whatever Israel does, we are accountable for, but we have no ability to shape it. And if, as I believe, Israel is on a course that is disastrous to its own future, then we are in the position of the man who hands the car keys to a drunk at a party. So enablement is the issue here, perhaps as much as, it's a form of moral hazard. So I don't have any hesitation in saying that I think Israel's following the wrong policies. I don't think we shouldn't support Israel, but I think we should not be unconditional and we should not create moral hazard.
Since you spend time in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, this became a major area of concern, really, with the oil situation and the formation of OPEC. I mean, why did we have to go into Iraq? And why have we supported Saudi Arabia even when there are human rights problems and the status of women and so forth? And of course, there's also the contrast. Israel is a real democracy, and Israel is really under attack and needs to defend its very being when rockets come from Gaza and so forth. So how can we reevaluate the Middle East these days? Well,
there are many questions buried there. I think In the case of Saudi Arabia, our interests are not limited to oil. I would cite several, which are key. One is you can't get between Europe and Asia except over Saudi Arabia or around it. It is a tremendous strategic line of communications, blockage or facilitator. The second, it is the epicenter of a religion that has 1.6 billion adherents around the world, and it has a certain moral authority that is very persuasive under some circumstances. Third, it's our largest market in the region. And it is vital to the health of the global economy. We have never been dependent on Saudi oil, but the global economy is. They are the swing producer that regulates the prices. And they're also, of course, now our major partner in counterterrorism, since we have the same enemies. And why we have the same enemies is an interesting question. In the case of Israel, well, I would reject, as I said at the outset, an ideologically based foreign policy. I don't think we're in a position to impose our standards on others. I think we need to think first and foremost of our own interests. So I don't think that because a country is a democracy like France, for example, that means we have to back France on every issue. I notice sometimes we don't. In fact, we invent strange things like freedom fries to avoid saying French. So in the case of Israel, frankly, it's not true that it's a democracy. It's a democracy for its Jewish inhabitants. It rules over 4 million Palestinians who are divided into 3 categories. Those who have a vote as second-class citizens within Israel, those who are under military occupation in the West Bank, and those who are under constant siege in Gaza. So there are 4 categories of people who live in the area controlled by Israel. Only one category has the full rights of democracy. But even if democracy were extended to the entire group, I think we'd still have to look first to our interests and not to alleged unity of values. I don't think that the Israeli, well, this obviously gets us into all sorts of issues, but it is not the case that the rockets precede the Israeli attacks. The Israeli attacks precede the rockets. The rockets are a futile, totally ineffectual response by desperate people. And they are objectionable morally because these are not aimed. They could kill someone. In fact, they kill almost no one, and not because of Iron Dome, partly because Israel has a very, very good civil defense system, but partly because they mostly land in places where there aren't any people. Final point, shifts in the oil market. Shale oil, tight oil, shale gas. For 10 or 15 years, this is going to give the United States strategic self-sufficiency, not independence, because in fact we will be exporting and importing all kinds of different forms of energy. We will not be independent of the world in terms of the level of price, and if you doubt that, I hope you're not invested in some of the marginal shale oil producers at the moment as oil prices go down. We can't separate ourselves from the world. And that means that even countries with which we do not share common values have to be dealt with. Those we do share common values with, of course, are also there and have to be dealt with. And we may have a greater affinity for those with whom we share values, but in the end, it's our interests that have to drive us, and do. Whenever a democratization attempt is made in a place, and elections produce a government we do not like, as happened in Palestine in 2006, has happened in Egypt several times, we have no compunction about overthrowing it. I rest my case.
What was it in the air at the APEC conference that seemed to make Xi Jinping change from a rather provocative, proactively troublemaker to making nice all of a sudden? What's your view of that apparent shift in strategy?
Well, I think it's entirely apparent, and it's a product of our media narrative rather than the reality. He never was the assertive monster that people here made him out to be, nor is he the nice guy that they now think he is. And I'll just summarize it like that. But in the case of China, we are dealing with something that is truly remarkable. Since 1880, we have been the largest economy in the world. We are not now. Not in PPP terms. We will not be in absolute terms by the end of the decade. We shaped the institutions after World War II to our liking. The global governance is an American creation and operation. Because of the dysfunctionality in our own system, we've been unable to exercise leadership, and we're now seeing the Chinese not destroying those legacy institutions, but building alternatives to them. So this is a consequence of our dysfunctional government, not of Chinese assertiveness. They waited a long time, and they've behaved reasonably responsibly. We have military problems with the Chinese, but let's remember that we are in their face. You know, they're not sitting off San Diego. We're sitting off Shanghai. Every issue, of course, goes back to the issue of empathy. Every issue has varying perspectives. And I'm sorry to say that even the New York Times, which normally sets the gold standard, it produces reporting on China that anybody who knows China well, and I'm bilingual in Chinese, and I lived there, and I go back, finds a caricature, really laughable, and consistent with narratives. Narratives are substitutes for reason. If you know what should be, then a fact can fit into that narrative, and you're happy, and you don't have to think. And that is a lot of what we do with Russia, with China, with even Japan, with our allies in Europe. We have preconceptions where we don't question them.
I was hoping that you would elaborate a little bit more on your views on al-Qaeda counterterrorism, particularly because you've talked a lot about how we have to have contact with our enemy, and that we don't have this policy towards terrorist organizations.
First, let us remember what has happened. For 13 years, we have been engaged in killing people in very large numbers, sometimes on the ground, more often from the air, and more recently from robots in the air. And the results are in. This did not halt or reduce the spread of anti-American terrorism, which is what we ought to be concerned about. The results of our policies have been to metastasize, not cauterize the problem. It has spread. We now have issues in West and North Africa. We have issues in Yemen. We have issues in Pakistan, which has been destabilized. We have issues in Indonesia and the Philippines, and we have in southern Thailand, and we have issues in Europe. Fortunately, not much here yet. But the treatment of this phenomenon of terrorism as an apolitical military phenomenon is a mistake. Now, as for engagement with groups in general, I mean, the purposes of engagement, just to round this out since you started off with that, David, is first of all to collect intelligence on another state or an organization so that you understand its motives and its reasoning and its decision-making process. You know, the CIA would love to, I don't think you're the person, young lady, but if you really want to go spend time living with bearded men who have fleas in a cave somewhere, they would love to recruit you. Another purpose of engagement, of course, is to convey your position to the other side directly, accurately, not through an intermediary. And you want to cultivate a relationship with the other side that's conducive to either problem solving or problem prevention. And you want to maybe buy time or negotiate a solution or show that you're doing something about things, and so forth. And you want to keep open lines of communication during hostilities. The idea that diplomacy stops when war begins is crazy. You need to have contact with the other side. That's when you need it most. And there's a great Chinese example here. In the Sino-Indian border war of 1962, China did not pull its embassy out of New Delhi. In the Sino-Vietnamese war of 1979, the Chinese ambassador stayed in Hanoi. Why? Because that's when those institutions are most useful. Nothing is contrary to what the common phrase in the Arab world, the kul shay maktub, everything is written. Nothing is written. Nothing is inevitable. There is always a way to shift things. And what diplomats are paid to do is to figure out how to do that. And if you shove them out of the way and send in the drones, you're losing an opportunity.
Amen. And on that optimistic note, I wish it'd been more thought-provoking, but we thank you anyway, and thank you for being with us.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.